I think you have the third most popular voice on the podcast.
Well, there's only 4 of us, so I don't know if that's a good thing.
I mean, it's not a bad thing.
Hi, folks. This is Louis Herfin, the original Peter Abernathy. Hell is empty and all the devils are here on the Shat on TV Westworld podcast with Roger, Gene, and Big D.
Welcome back to Shat on TV Westworld, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series Westworld. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me is my co-host, Ashley Schlafly.
Hi, y'all.
And before you stop playing this podcast, before you unsubscribe, yes, Big D is not here with us tonight. Yes, everything is fine. Big D had an internet outage, so Ashley and I got his notes from him. He has advised on this episode. And I think we're making a pledge to you today, dear listeners, that if you continue listening to us for this episode, this one episode, we will try to be as fun and exciting as humanly possible.
Yeah, we're not just nerds. We're cool, sort of, right?
Yeah, we're not smug.
No.
We're not French.
No, I'm putting on the humble Ashley, the normal fun Ashley hat for this episode, the Texas accent Ashley, because we got apparently there were a couple of posts where people, it's like those almost compliments, like, hey, this was the first time I really liked you. And I was like, thanks for the almost compliment, people. So it's going to be good. I promise.
So if you stick with us, the pledge is hang out for an hour. This is what's going to happen. We're going to dive deep into everything that happened on episode 7 of Westworld season 3, Past Pawn. We're not going to go plot point by plot point, but we're going to jump into the biggest topics from the episode. That'll include a new view of Caleb, what we know about him now and what that could mean for the future. The entire idea of a past pawn strategy from chess that Ashley will cover. We're also going to get into callbacks. There were so many in this episode. And as we started the list, it just kept growing and growing and growing. So some of them you may have caught. Some of them might be a surprise. We're going to go through those. And then assorted odds and ends. And there are a lot to cover in this episode. I think it's one of those episodes that as you watch again, you realize just how much they jam-packed into an hour. If you haven't written in for our Telegraph, that comes out on Friday. That is our listener mail and voicemail segment of Shat on TV Westworld. You can do that at host@shatontv.com or call 914-719-SHAT. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be picking the top emails and voicemails from the week and sharing them in the Telegraph. And then, as always, join us on Friday at shatontv.com/Twitch, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern for our Shappy Hour. We have a great time every week. The audience grows every week. And of course, on Sunday, after the season finale, join Roger back at shatontv.com/Twitch for the live chat immediately after the Westworld episode to share your ideas. We had a great audience. I believe it was over 70 viewers last time. So it's really, really wonderful. And it's great to see that grow as well. So, Ash, I know that you and I had mixed feelings about this episode, and it sounded like people on social media were having an absolute meltdown. Now that we've had 24 hours after the Instacast to review Past Pawn, any new enlightenment on it or any impressions that the audience made on you?
So I've had a lot of conversations today, especially on YouTube, and I was really surprised by how many people genuinely didn't like this episode. There were a lot of complaints. I think you could put them in 2 buckets. One, the Maeve complaints that people are really upset with her storyline this season, and especially in this episode where badass Maeve kind of became, oh no, I'm going to lose Maeve. You know, it just kind of didn't fall in line with what we know Maeve is capable of doing. And then the other side of that is people who genuinely just don't seem to like Caleb and don't like his storyline. And so I think that you've got some discontent on both sides of the aisle in terms of both humans and host. Me personally, I still feel pretty mixed about this episode, to be honest, but I'm trying to not judge it because penultimate episodes always are a companion piece with the finale. And so I don't ever never like to judge a penultimate episode until I've seen the whole thing. I mean, we learned that especially with Game of Thrones, right? I mean, the two were kind of two halves of the same whole. And with GOT, especially, for example, like in season 6, like you had this amazing dish that got served when it was all put together, right? You had the appetizer and then this fucking entree that came in. And so I'm believing that it's going to pay off, that we're going to have a reveal. But as far as this is a standalone episode, I would say, kind of, like not bad, but it's definitely not my favorite episode of the season or of the series for sure.
Yeah, when season 3 started, we noted that there were only 8 episodes instead of 10 and kind of braced ourselves for a really quick ride. I feel some of the time wasn't used as expertly as it could be. But like you said, until we see the finished work, the entire body of work, including the finale, it's really too soon to say how we feel about it. Both of us during the course of the season, however, fell in love with 2 characters, Serac and Caleb. And Caleb really took up the bulk of this episode.
Absolutely. We have spent 2 different deep dives where we have kind of put together a file of sorts, a dossier on who this new character is, who Caleb is. And we learned a lot to add to that file in the episode last night. One of the first things I think that's important is we got to see in a bit more in detail what Caleb's service record looks like in the military and what his time there, what he kind of spent it doing. We know now that Caleb and Francis, that they were serving in a Black Ops unit of sorts in Russia, specifically Crimea. His whole unit gets knocked out. They all get killed. And so he and Francis, they're sent home. And we also get the confirmation of Caleb's skull fracture here that we saw in the timeline a couple of episodes ago when he was kind of blown up by this explosive device that killed his fellow soldier. But we've, of course, yet to see still, though, why he would say that he's been shot in the head before, like he did in episode 1. Do you think that this was kind of our answer to that?
Yeah, I don't know. That was a really peculiar scene when he had a gun pulled on him and said that wasn't the first time he'd had a gun pulled on him. And then he was asked if he'd ever been shot in the head. And he's like, that's not the first time for that either. I'm willing to say, you know what? Westworld's fed us some red herrings in the past. Shot in the head, shrapnelled in the noggin. He's a veteran. He might just be using a colloquialism.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I may be reading too much into it, but I think it would be interesting to see at some point if something else, happened to him. And this is from Big D. So he wanted us to make sure that we kind of gave a counter to the first point that I just said about his military service, because from Big D's perspective, and actually he's not alone in this, he's concerned that we are reading kind of too much obvious into what we're seeing on the screen. And that in fact, Caleb maybe potentially was never actually in Russia, but was always killing U.S. civilians or doing other U.S. land-based operations the whole time. He specifically brought up to us those flashes that we see in the episode where it looks like he's killing a man at a 4th of July celebration. There are these U.S. flags flying, and Big D thinks maybe potentially that this entire Russian memory that we see throughout was a plant, not just in terms of the secondary piece that we know changes with where Francis dies, but that the first part as well, where they're doing this operation and it looks like it's in Russia. He thinks that it's a potential that actually isn't where the start of Caleb's U.S. Army career began. For me, I personally think that's a reach. We were told by data that was released prior to the season that there was a second Russian Civil War that began in the year 2037. We also know from Caleb's file that he was enlisted and deployed in 2042. And I think it could make sense that he's part of kind of wrapping up that second Russian World War and that whole conflict over there.
Although I appreciate and respect Big D's opinion on anything, I agree with you, Ash. I think the military service thing is real. And there's so many pieces that go along with it, right? The fractured skull, the military grade drip, his friendship with Francis, all those things would have had to been manufactured, including his ability to function in combat, including Caleb's ability to have, this medical knowledge. So now we're getting into the area where it'd be like Neo in the Matrix, where it's like wetware, right? You're basically having to train a guy to do everything. It makes much more sense to take somebody who you knew was an outlier, you assign him to war, He manages to survive somehow, despite your best efforts. He comes back, and it's like, okay, well, what use can you make of him? That seems like a much more likely situation to me.
I agree. I kind of took it almost like a metaphor that he's having this trouble writing this honorable service with what we know he eventually did. And so it's this patriotic celebration and then murder. And I think that he's having a hard time figuring out if he's a good guy or a bad guy. And so he's seeing this celebration of the good guys, which are our servicemen, which are our armed forces. And then there's also the murder that comes later on when he's using the Rico app, not in the service of the military. But I think that was kind of just that mind fuck that he's kind of going through. But whether we agree with that or not, we do know a second piece here, which is that eventually he gets sent home. Eventually he is honorably discharged from the military. And he ends up in one of Serac's reconditioning centers. We know that he is reconditioned, that he's one of what Solomon tells us is the lucky 10% that make it through this reconditioning process successfully. He says 9 out of the 10 do not. So he's a very small minority. And we know that both he and Francis, that they return at some point to a quote unquote real world where they start running these jobs for Rico. And I found someone had shared on Twitter, and I apologize to whoever you are out there because I forgot to write it down and then I couldn't find it later, but you had posted a picture of what these Rico logs actually look like, which shows all of the different jobs that Caleb took from the Rico app. And we kind of get a glimpse into what he and Francis were up to. And I was really surprised at just how personal these jobs were, since we know he says he doesn't do personals anymore, because there was lots of murder, assassination, what they classify specifically as double homicides, arsons, kidnapping, some failed enhanced interrogation, and just kind of this really violent tree of events that kind of lays out for us. And so either Caleb's limbic drugs were pretty awesome, or there's a part of him that isn't this kind soul that we potentially thought that he might be, which may give us a clue as to why Liam, as he's dying, says, he's, so dangerous, that he's the most dangerous one of them all, and is so frightened of him.
Early on this season, when we were analyzing the opening credit scenes for Westworld, we noted that there was this repeat imagery of a mirror. There's so many parallels between what's going on with humans and what was going on with hosts in the park. And among those is this reversal of hosts being victims and being wiped, and humans being perpetrators and being wiped. And I just kept thinking, if every horrific thing that I had ever done was sanitized by the false memory of doing it during a time of war to very, very bad people, my conscience might not feel that bad. Suddenly, murder, assassination, double homicide, arson, kidnapping don't seem that bad. These guys did what they did because they thought they were doing the right thing. And if you think of the Westworld guests, humans in Westworld were doing what they did because they thought the hosts were just robots and shouldn't remember or feel anything. As long as the system is what you understand, you might not feel that bad about it. But as we've seen in this, reality is kind of in the eye of the beholder.
Well, it is for sure. I mean, before we are recording, I was playing in a tournament on Mortal Kombat 11, right? And that's an incredibly violent game. And so here I am as Katana, ripping people's heads off and causing massive fatalities. And if you extend that out to thinking about how Westworld is like a real life video game, kind of like a real life Sims or a real life, first person interactive role playing game, I can understand how you could convince your brain that it's not real, that there's nothing wrong with it. And that could be extended too, I think, into what Caleb and Francis are doing. But that's where kind of all of this gets very complicated for me. And this is a call out to listeners. We've already received a plethora of emails that have come in, but I would specifically ask if any of you guys can kind of help us untangle this knot. I think this is where I get a little confused with this episode, because Caleb was clearly reconditioned after Francis died. But my question is this a first reconditioning or a second reconditioning? Because did he and Francis know what they were doing, that they were collecting all of these outliers before Francis is killed, or after? Basically, when is Caleb treated as an outlier? And I mean that treated very specifically, like treated in this Serac center. And I find it difficult personally to believe that statistically, knowing that only 10% of the population that receives these treatments actually makes it out, that both Caleb and his friend would make it out of a treatment that is so difficult. Just that does not seem statistically probable. So my question is, did they just go start working Rico jobs after they came back? And then Caleb is brought to the reconditioning center after Francis is killed because of kind of this break that happens when he's forced in a way to kill his best friend. My question there is specifically related to this idea of what then is an outlier, because we don't know when Caleb was classified as an outlier. We know he was sent to war, but we don't know that every soldier is an outlier, right? We know that they're put on the front lines and put in these risky positions, but just because he's a soldier doesn't mean he was an outlier. And so is it possible that he's tagged as an outlier once he kills Francis? Does Solomon, Rehoboam, do they mark you as an outlier once they figure out that there's something glitchy there? And I don't think this is what Raj suggested on the Twitch stream, where he said you kind of have to have something wrong with you, or these people that are crazy or schizophrenic, that they're all outliers. I don't think that's the case. I think that it has to be something that threatens order, where you're threatening this fabric of society. And I could see that killing the one person you're loyal to for years with absolutely no hesitation, that could be a definitive moment when for the system, you become that divergence and you become that outlier.
I don't think people in this show, human beings, understand why an outlier is an outlier. So we talked earlier in the season about neural nets and AI. And the reason why the show might not tell us what an outlier is, other than the fact that it diverges from the plan, is because there is no core criteria. So we talked earlier in the season about AI thinking in a black box, right? You put input in, you get a response out. That response is accurate, but you don't know exactly how the machine is thinking, because machines think differently than we do. And if they had to stop and explain themselves to us, we would never understand anyway. Talking about advanced neural nets and AI, right? So what indexes a person as an outlier is simply that they pose an existential threat to the desired strategy. That's it. It's not that they're crazy, tall, short, black, white. The system doesn't care. All it does is it knows if this person continues on this path, it will ruin things if you're trying to get to this end goal. And so the solution is you got to kill that person. You got to freeze that person. You got to reform that person. But getting back to your point about Francis and Caleb, that's a very good point. It seems highly suspicious that both of them were in that, 10%, although they do have similar life experiences. Maybe that preconditions you to being amenable to this sort of treatment. My belief is that this has been going on for a while, before and after he killed Francis, for a couple of reasons. One is we see both of them taking those limbic treatments, right? So it seems that they've both been through the same program. They're going through a habitual trained behavior that they do for coping. Another reason is that we see Caleb with two different lengths of hair when he is being treated. So it might be two different points in his life. Once with the shaved head is right when he got back from war. With the longer hair, it might be after he killed Francis. Now, it could be that he's having flashbacks and putting himself in those flashbacks, in which case his hair would be longer anyway. So that's not really super reliable.
I think that what you're saying is really interesting, because I think that with regard to the military service, we know that they probably use these limbic drugs, because that's why they have the drips. That's why they have this military grade drips. And it certainly would make it much easier to be in combat, to have all of those emotions kind of, whisked away, so that you're able to be a lot more effective. With regard to outliers, you're right. I don't think the system's ever going to explain it to us, but I do think it's interesting that the system doesn't take babies. So they obviously can't know that you're an outlier from the start. There has to be a catalyst. There has to be a moment that happens. And I know they say in the episode that they can prevent outliers from reproducing. So they know that an outlier could beget an outlier, right? But they don't know how to stop those outliers from entering the world. And so I just think it's interesting. And I just think it would be really, really neat if the idea here is that you become an outlier when you make a decision that the machine can't predict, that that's what makes you dangerous. And what is less predictable than killing your best friend in cold blood?
That's a really good point. I'm of the mind that this program that's referred to earlier in the season that Caleb is in is this persistent conditioning, right? So it's Francis in his ear via AI. It's those visits to the therapist. What remains to be seen is why Caleb was retired. That's the question we don't have an answer to. He was killing. Now he doesn't do personals. Is it that he's no longer useful? Did he have an incident that ruined his streak? Is it because he killed Francis? Or maybe that after he killed Francis, he was never the same and not functional as a tool of the system?
That's a really interesting question, actually. And I think the answer to that question and some sort of answer as to why Caleb is an outlier in general, maybe not all outliers, but why he specifically is an outlier, for me, that's kind of on my wish list for what the season finale answers, because I think that would help me understand Dolores better. I think it would help me understand why she's making the decisions she is, why the season's unfolding the way it is. I discussed on the Instacast that I kind of need motivations for some of these decisions that are being made. And I think this is the biggest one, is why is Dolores selected Caleb? Why is he selected as the leader? And why does he matter? And why does Dolores care? Because right now, it all kind of seems disconnected. It feels like a simulation. And speaking of simulations, at 2 points in this episode, we see registration numbers. So Bernard, when he's looking up William on that big screen, he has a code, and it is UM2702-100-1912B, as in boy. Or what does Big D say? Would it be Beta? Bravo? Now, you know I'm a nerd because I went with Beta. B for Bravo. And later on, Stubbs shows Bernard a tablet that has Caleb's info on it, and it says, drumroll, the same exact number. So both Caleb and William have the same exact subject identification set of letters and numbers. My question to you, Jean, and to the listeners out there is, does that mean that we just got confirmation that Caleb is the man in black? I know those of you that are listening may point out that Caleb's tablet also has another number up top that has the letter C rather than B. Are we seeing copies then like the Dolores? Or are there man in black copies out there? I don't know. Is it that he's the man in black? Or is it that Caleb's a guest? Is he an avatar for the man in black? And is this whole goddamn thing a simulation and future world? Or is it Serac that's trying to see how things play out? All of that makes me want to gag. I don't know about you, but I really hope that this was some sort of fluke to throw us off, because, I'll be really disappointed in that.
They're definitely trying to push us toward something of that nature. Now, Bernard, when they're in the Sonora, Mexico facility, says to William, according to this, you're already dead. And then just to help out, the screen behind him also is like deceased in big red letters. So we know that he's allegedly dead to the system. But, Bernard and Stubbs also said that Serac tends to disappear people and make them appear missing or dead. So I wouldn't barf just yet. Yeah, it's likely that they're probably the same dude or something like that. But there's still a chance that episode 8 throws that knockout punch from the back of the crowd, hits us with something we never saw coming, and saves the day. If they can tell the story in a compelling way, cool. It's not exactly my cup of tea on its face.
Well, and let me just clarify. I think the thing I would be most disappointed by if the whole thing's a simulation, because then I'll feel like this whole season was wasted in a way. I mean, it was fun to watch. It was a cool story, but I just want it to move us forward. And I don't know if I would feel like a simulation did that. And I agree with you. I don't want to tell it what to do or what not to do, but I just would feel like we were these pawns in this game to kind of drag us along through a season before they get to another story in the next season, if that makes any sense. But speaking of pawns, the episode was entitled Past Pawn. And like I said, jokingly, but not jokingly, my husband really was a competitive chess player. He was homeschooled until 7th grade. And this is what he did for his social outreach, was he played chess. And he's very good at chess. If you follow me on Twitter, I beat him for the first time in 8 years last year, and he threw the biggest hissy fit of all time. It is on my Twitter. He curses, he throws one of the pieces, he blames it on being a Star Wars chessboard. It's hilarious. Please go watch it. But with that in mind, I went to him and I said, okay, let's talk about past pawns. And we'll keep this very brief, but I do think it's interesting to think about looking into the finale. So those of you who don't play chess, in chess, all of the pieces have an assigned numeric value. They have a point value assigned to them. So a queen, she's worth 9 because of her power, the variability of her movement. The knight is 3, the rook is 5, and so on until you get to the lowly little pawn. The most pieces that are the same are pawns. They have the most numbers that exist on the board. And because of that and the fact that they can't move in a lot of interesting ways, they're worth a whopping 1 point comparatively to the other pieces. But the pawns are not throwaways in a chess game. They are actually a valuable tool, particularly in the end game of chess when you're trying to achieve that checkmate. So as stated in the episode title, the idea of a passed pawn is basically that it's a term for when a pawn has no other pieces ahead of it. The goal in chess, the ultimate goal, is to make it to the 8th rank, which is just the fancy way of saying to the other end of the board. And if you can get your pawn to the other end of the board, then it can become anything you want it to be that's already been taken away from you. So a lowly pawn can become a queen, it become a bishop, it become anything that has been removed from your team. So basically, it can be kind of a total game changer because it takes on this identity of what you've already lost. And so the use of a passed pawn, it makes a lot of sense. It's really great for your strategy, but it does require lots of forethought, and it requires a lot of sacrifices of the other pieces on the board, particularly other pawns, because if you're surrounding it, you're doing what's called a protected passed pawn, you've got all these other pawns that are surrounding it and sacrificing themselves so that this one particular pawn can make it to the other end. And we know that Dolores is making lots of sacrifices this season, right? We know that she sacrificed her copies, like Connell's, like Charred Loris almost died. She got burned up and her family's dead. And Dolores is even willing to sacrifice herself to help Caleb get the information, to obtain this plan, to move forward, to do what she calls leading the revolution. So I think that it's interesting to think about that because clearly Caleb is the passed pawn here. And clearly she's made these sacrifices. But based off of that, my 2 questions are what's going to happen when he gets to that 8th rank, which I think he has done now that they've reached kind of the belly of the beast and they're in this center and met Solomon. What's he going to do with that information? And what identity now is he going to take on that's been lost? We know the man in black's labeled as deceased. Does he become the man in black? Does he become Dolores? Does he become Robert Ford? I don't know. But clearly a new identity, I think, is coming for him.
Some people wrote in after this episode aired and complained about the shift in Dolores's nature, right? She left the park at the end of season 2 on a warpath, like a Terminator, determined to wipe out humanity. And in this episode, we see her sacrificing herself, it appears, also like the Terminator, to get Caleb to where he needs to be and instill these ideas in him. And I'll admit that is pretty peculiar. But if Game of Thrones season 8 taught us anything, it's audiences aren't crazy about a passed pawn resolution when they're highly attached to the other characters of the story, right? Like, no one was happy with Bran sitting on the throne because he had the dubiously subjective title of the best story. But we really like Caleb. I think the audience in general really likes Caleb, and it might make it a little more palatable if this happens. Westworld, what it needs to do with 1 episode left for the season is really give us a compelling reason to believe he is special. Whether that's he's the man in black, whether that's he's the last hope for humanity, whether that's he's the harbinger of doom, whatever it is, you got to make it worth it, right? It's like Saving Private Ryan when Captain Miller says, "Earn this." You got to earn this, Caleb.
Agreed. And I hope that 1 more episode is long enough for him to do that and for us to buy into it. I think even a bigger disappointment than what we've already talked about is if it's a cliffhanger, right? Like if they leave it and then part 2 comes in, season 4.
Now, during the Instacast, we talked about callbacks in this episode. And as Big D and Ashley and I sat down and started counting them up, the number just kept growing and growing. And I want to start out with Clementine's Reveries, because Westworld is a show that's both nostalgic and self-aware. It's not a young show. Remember, we're now in the 3rd season, and it's been years since the 1st season aired. This is a show with history and plenty of rich history to draw back on. So it's fitting that Clementine returned to the screen with a reverie. Only this time, instead of touching her own face, she's touching Sato's or Musashi's, right? She recognizes Musashi in there and recognizes Dolores in there. It was a really Clementine move, and it immediately did take me back to season 1. It was very effective. It reminded me of that time when we were watching this new show called Westworld, and we were all so innocent and thought this was just a show about boobs and guns and robots and cowboys.
Yeah. The nostalgic days, right? Season 1 back in Sweetwater. I have to say, it was nice to see Clementine. I'm not an overtly sentimental person, especially with television shows. I'm not a big fan of callbacks usually, but this one kind of hit me like it was supposed to. It was really nice to see her. It felt good to see her. She looks beautiful, but how did they fix her? I mean, that was my one question is, they stuck the thing up her nose in season 2. So they scrambled her brains basically. And I was glad to see she wasn't zombie Clementine. I didn't want a zombie Clementine, but I know it probably doesn't matter, but this is a show that doesn't typically give us plot holes. And so they gave us these great callbacks, but then they didn't explain away the biggest thing, which is how is she even there?
The next callback isn't very significant to the story, but I think it's important to us, very important to us. So whether you call it a slaughterhouse, a meat farm, or the meat factory, that protein production facility where Bernard worked as Armand Delgado, it actually made a cameo in episode 7. A lot of people pointed this out. The billboard next to the gas station where Bubs finds a car and the man in black finds a shotgun reads lab to slab. I thought that was a clever bit of world building. It was very, very Fallout New Vegas. But on a more serious note, we got to talk about this cold storage scene, another callback that we saw in this episode. If it wasn't obvious enough, Dolores flat out says it out loud. We're in cold storage, like we were in cold storage. Delos puts faulty hosts in cold storage, deep in the sublevels of the Mesa. Solomon has humans in literal cold storage underground at the Sonora facility. They're really trying hard to make it very clear to us that the situation is parallel.
Yeah, we're all the same. Look at how we're all the same. I have been really surprised, though, at the amount of people on social media who are very concerned about these people in cold storage. There was this whole thread I read today about people arguing about the technology and whether or not they would be protected from the EMP or if they would all just die or if they would awaken. I mean, people are really concerned about these cold storage bodies.
If Idiocracy taught us anything, they'll be fine. They're going to wake up in a world where they're smarter than everybody else, and it'll be okay. Our next callback is the memory wipes and emotional reset. So at the beginning of season 3, we puzzled over why Caleb wakes up every day the same way that we saw Dolores and Maeve wake up every day in Westworld. Now that we know about how Caleb and Francis were programmed and medicated, this totally makes sense. Those limbic wafers that they're taking help calm them down and numb them. But we also learned from episode 7 that they cause disassociation and they make memories easier to erase and alter. But just like the hosts, Caleb's wipes don't completely work as planned. And so memories tend to leak through. It's scrambling his brain and causing him to act erratically, again, just like a host. So digging back further, we get a callback to the Judas steer conversation that Dolores had with Teddy. So Dolores once told Teddy the story of the Judas steer, which is basically a steer that leads other cattle to slaughter and then is released back out again. They don't kill the Judas steer because he's so good at bringing other cattle into the slaughter. In Past Pawn, episode 7, we learned that a really effective way to find outliers is to attract them with other outliers and use outliers to hunt them. Therefore, Caleb is unwittingly playing the role of Judas Steer as he takes out other outliers for the system.
I found today an old legend of Solomon. We did a lot of talking about Solomon and Rehoboam in the Bible in our very first deep dive and what their names were and the significance. And going back to Solomon, there's this legend that he enslaved demons to build holy temples. And so that's kind of fitting that we're showing that Solomon, as the AI, is enslaving those cast out, those outliers to build his world by rounding up those other outliers through the Rico app. It's a really, really nice irony.
So the next callback is like a multi-layered callback. It goes pretty deep, and it starts out with when Hanaryo cuts Sato like in two with that katana blade, right? So she goes from like rib to rib. But anyway, it's a callback to when Akane very graphically in season 2 assassinated the Shogun. Where it goes a level deeper is that she takes Sato's head. So she actually takes Musashi's head with her, which is what Sato failed to do when he defeated Maeve earlier in the season. And this is really important because now Team Maeve actually has 1 to 3 Dolores pearls in its possession, if you count the Connell's pearl that Charloris swiped and the one still controlling Charloris. So if you take Charloris pearl, the Connell's pearl that she got out of the Daedalus headquarters, and then the one that they just pulled off of Musashi, it is possible that Team Maeve now has 3 Dolores pearls. What they will do with them, I don't know, but they could have them.
Yeah, because the question is it Team Maeve that has them or Serac that has them? Because I think the two of them would do 2 very, very different things with those pearls.
Now, in this episode, we also hear Dolores' sensibilities described as poetic. And that brings us to the parallel between Sonora, Mexico, and Westworld. What could be more poetic than proposing to build a new place that looks like the old place, right? I thought this was an interesting choice on Dolores' part. Like, you want to build a bastion for hosts and then make it look like the hellish prison you all lived in?
Hey, it's home, right? I mean, I think that that's home for a lot of people. I think that it's not necessarily a place that has all good memories, but it's what you know. And Westworld is what it's what she knows. And what was interesting here is it was such a direct copy of the conversation she has with Teddy in season 2 as they're standing there looking out and she's explaining to him who the humans are and what they are. And if you actually watch it in tandem, the score is identical. It's exactly the same with her talking to Teddy and her talking to Caleb. And so I think that's pretty poetic. And I don't know. I think that it's a beautiful place and it makes sense for her. I mean, the Valley Beyond also, it's very nature friendly. So maybe that's just what they like.
Now, Big D sent this one in. He was talking about the EMP. I think we shouldn't take it for granted that everybody knows what an EMP is. So it's an electromagnetic pulse. And basically it's a special type of quote unquote bomb. It doesn't like blow up like an explosion. It's not like a thermal explosion, but rather it sends out an electric pulse that just knocks out electronics, right? It fries your electronics. And this is a real thing. Like, they exist in the world. You can use them to knock out enemy, anti-aircraft or communications. So Dolores takes a look at the EMP early in this episode when she's telling Solomon that his creator took steps to ensure that he couldn't leave the Sonora facility. And as she's talking to Solomon, Big D points out she's rubbing her neck at the time, likely thinking about the explosive device that is in every host's C6 vertebrae, right? We found out about in season 1 that prevents them from leaving the Delos Island. So the idea here is essentially she's seeing this leash placed on Solomon and is reminded of her own leash and the leash that was applied to so many other hosts until they found a way to circumvent it.
Yeah, I completely missed this. I thought this was actually really interesting and went back and watched this particular scene. I had actually forgotten about the explosive devices, which I shouldn't have because Stubbs tried to explode himself earlier this season. But I do think that's interesting. Although I found one of the funniest lines when Dolores says that she's so much like Solomon that they're alike. And he's like, we're nothing alike. So maybe she's a lot more sentimental, let's just put it that way, than he is.
The next callback ties together Solomon and the bicameral mind. So when Solomon is speaking to Dolores and Caleb, he says he could do it in any voice they choose. Big D wrote in and said, I take this as a reference to the season 1 concept of the bicameral mind. And a large part of Dolores' journey toward consciousness in season 1 was tied to her ability to stop hearing her maker, or Arnold, as a voice in her head and instead start to hear her own voice and her own thoughts. Then she became her own god. So Big D is hypothesizing that maybe this is signaling that Caleb, isn't quite ready to go there yet because he's not comfortable hearing his own voice. Now, it's also interesting that Solomon says to Caleb, some people find it comforting to hear their own voice. And again, if you go back to the idea of the bicameral mind, it's hearing your own voice. It was when the human mind in its development was confused by the fact that one part of the mind was telling another part of the mind what to do in a controlling fashion, and it attributed it to the concept of a god or a higher power.
Yeah, I can't imagine it being comforting at all to hear my own voice in that moment. Like, that would be just, first of all, I hate my own voice. Like, I have trouble listening to the podcast because I despise the way my voice sounds. And I just can't. I would want a nice French accent like that. Like, that's very calming. I can't imagine wanting your own voice instead.
I think you have the 3rd most popular voice on the podcast.
Well, there's only 4 of us, so I don't know if that's a good thing.
It's not a bad thing.
What is the ranking? Big D's first, obviously.
Yes. I think it's Big D, Roger, you, and then me.
Really? You think that you're fourth?
Oh, yeah.
I wish we were doing Shapier right now. We need to do a poll on that because I find your voice more appealing than Roger's. And I find mine the least appealing because I do so much upspeak. I do a lot of intonations. I just can't help it. So
Yeah, but you have fun T's. Your T's are fun.
my T's are fun?
Yeah.
Give me an example of a word with a T.
Well, when you listen to this podcast later, you'll hear the way you say your T's.
Interesting. My T's are fun. Learn something new every day.
Yeah, so join us on Friday Shappy Hour where we'll take a poll and see who's got the most popular voice on Shat on TV. All right, the next callback is the idea of is this now and disassociation of time. So back in season 1, Dolores said, is this now? Am I going mad? Are you real? I can't tell anymore. It's like I'm trapped in a dream or a memory from a life long ago, which of course would describe Caleb in this episode as well. In both cases, these characters' flashbacks are triggered by someone asking them to start at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's kind of neat that Dolores is introducing the human version of reveries in this episode, that her reverie is by giving him these memories back. And I think that's a neat callback as well.
And it extends even further, really, to Solomon. So Solomon doesn't know which time he is in, which reality he is in, if it's a simulation or not. And just to clarify, going back to your whole, I hope this whole season isn't just a simulation of the world. There is no definitive indicator in this that Solomon is seeing the real now, right? Like as a supercomputer and as an AI and as apparently a machine that has inherited some traits from a person who is schizophrenic, he also is very disassociated in his ways. And maybe that's the only way to really handle this sort of reality. And finally, one that I was most excited about as far as callbacks go is this idea of humans interviewing AI and then AI interviewing humans. So the visual parallel between humans being reprogrammed in their glass cells at the Sonora facility and hosts being taken to the glass rooms at Westworld's Mesa it's pretty clear. I encourage people to look a level deeper because when you do, you realize that there's a role reversal happening inside the interview room with Caleb's therapy. So in Westworld, humans are performing diagnostics on hosts. Then they take the little tablets out, they adjust their personalities, their identities, and even their abilities to make them functional for the world that they're about to live in. In the Sonora facility, it's the opposite, right? That proctor that Caleb is working with, that woman, the therapist or the doctor, whatever you want to call her, she likely doesn't exist. She's probably software built into the AR experience, right? They plug it in, they put the goggles on, he sees a person there talking to him. She's probably not real. So in one case, you had humans running tests on hosts. Now at the Sonora facility, it's the opposite. It's the software running tests on humans. And that brings us to our odds and ends. This is just a grab bag section where we could talk about anything else that came to mind that we really wanted to talk about, but didn't really fit into any other category. And the one I wanted to start with, Ash, is what is Charlotte up to? We talked about a lot of things in this episode and people focused on a lot of parts. It seems like there's not much chatter about Charlotte, who kicked off the episode and you see her face and she's not burnt anymore, I guess. So either Charlotte has a face now or we're being shown a new mystery because she's not burnt up. So is it another copy of Charlotte? Did she get a facelift? I don't know. Do host face grow back? Maybe. But in case it wasn't clear, Clem and Hanaryo were able to find Sato because Charlotte leaked his location to Maeve. It's not like they just knew where he was. Ash, I think it was you or Big D said that, one of these Dolores might wander off so far, might diverge so far that they could side with Maeve in this great host war. We also saw that Bernard referred to a she who sent him and Stubbs to the Sonora facility, suggesting they could be acting on behalf of Charlotte. Now, it could be Dolores, might be Maeve herself. We don't know.
Well, and this is when I miss Big D on the podcast because this is an opportunity for another timeline explosion because the timeline here seems very, very rushed because how did Charlotte get a new body or how did she become unburned or whatnot? And when did she make contact with Maeve? How did she find Maeve? Did she go to Serac? Is that how she did it? I think there's a lot of questions there that I don't think we'll get answers to because there's only one more episode in the season. But I think this also could be another kind of clue that perhaps that Bernard Stubbs timeline is different than the one that we're seeing with Dolores.
Well, there's other possibilities. There's still somebody in Berlin that we haven't seen yet. It's possible. I mean, several days have clearly passed because of where people are physically, right? So Clem had to be printed, Hanaryo had to be printed, then they had to get their asses over to Jakarta. So I mean, you got some time passing, but it does seem a bit rushed. Thankfully, we're in a futuristic world where things can happen fast, as opposed to Game of Thrones, where people are jetpacking in Fantasyland. So I've defended Westworld for several episodes now against all the haters who keep pointing out how everyone in 2052 is an awful shot. I believe, Ash, you called them stormtroopers. Mm-hmm. But now the machines can't aim. You've got a drone-assisted 50 caliber sniper rifle that can't hit Maeve from like 20 yards away. You got a quadcopter gunship flying around that can't hit Dolores until it's convenient for the plot. On the upside, yeah, it was cool watching that cannon round remove her arm. It was awesome. But how the fuck do these machines not know how to shoot either?
Yeah. I don't know. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, I hate when weapons are so adept that they remove all mystery. So I actually didn't like the drone super gun because I think that's a bit too simple, and Dolores doesn't really need it because she's a badass. But I do agree, if it's able to do all this craziness, why can't that little drone just come out, see where Maeve is, and blow her up?
Now, a weapon used in a cool way was the EMP that was surrounding Solomon. So we've referenced it now, I think 4 or 5 times on the podcast. But in Josh Clark's End of the World podcast, they talk about how AI left unleashed would ultimately lead to our demise as a species. And one of the things they talk about is that you can't keep an AI locked up. Now, I'm not talking about a PC running a program. I'm talking about an AI that is smart enough to be functional and useful, like a Solomon or a Rehoboam, cannot be locked up. And people say, well, sure they can. They don't have legs. You don't give them internet access, right? You lock them in a room. Well, can anyone interact with them? Because they'll be smart enough to figure out how to manipulate that person to get out of the room. Like, that's what the AI would do. It's spending its entire time running scenarios to figure out which way it can get out. And it can run a million scenarios a minute, right? So it's going to outthink you. It's going to find a way out. So it was interesting that they had this EMP around Solomon as like the solution to not let him get out into the world, because if he did, then he could be dangerous.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting next week to see how they deal with the EMP and the consequences of it. If it is truly a military-grade EMP, then technically Dolores and Maeve's units should be knocked out for good. They shouldn't be able to be recovered. They should be kind of fried. So will they need to be reprinted, re-downloaded? I don't know how they're going to deal with that. I hope that they don't just like pop back up after, an hour's passed or 2 hours passed, or there's some sort of weird like robo smelling salts that wakes them up. But I do think that they're going to have to deal with that. And then of course the question too is that drive that Caleb has that Solomon gave him, is that going to be all right?
So technically, hard drives don't get erased by EMP blasts, meaning that the data is not wiped from it. But you're absolutely right. With the drive and with the host, any electronic components are going to get fried. So the data can still be recovered, but the unit itself is no longer functional. And it's a very intricate process to pull that data, reconstruct it into a functioning unit, and then be able to get it out of there. So if they're fair about this and give the EMP real consequences, these hosts should not be functional anytime soon. And that drive will need some major rebuilding to pull data. And speaking of Solomon, the last episode 6, was Decoherence. And we kind of took a pass on explaining Decoherence because we didn't want to take 20 minutes of the podcast up and bore the shit out of people. So we found shorter ways to kind of summarize what it means. And it can mean a lot of things depending on the context. But I found it exciting that Solomon himself pointed out that certain strategies decohered, right? And they were saying like, well, what if we want to do this, this, or this? And they said, well, those people are dead now, so this strategy is decohered. And in this sense, Solomon is saying that information has been lost to the environment because of elements outside the closed system, right? So you had a strategy, it was functional, it was a closed system, it would have worked perfectly, but something pulled or changed the data, and therefore the whole thing came apart. It was no longer coherent. So I really enjoyed that, straight from the AI's mouth.
I thought it was interesting that that satellite system that was dropping the missiles, that it was called St. Nicholas because it knew who was naughty and who was nice. I thought that that was kind of silly, but just wanted to throw that out there as a little Easter egg of something I found out, reading about the episode today.
And finally, we have a very special odds and ends, and it's a personal one. It's a shout out to Jacob, whose birthday it is this week. So it's a shout out from your wife, Catherine, from me, Ash, Big D, Roger, and the King Bee. Catherine's become a regular friend of the podcast on Twitter and Twitch, and is a lot of fun on the Shappy Hour and keeps in touch with us all week. So thanks both of you for listening and supporting the podcast. We wish you the best and happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
All right, and that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Westworld Deep Dive. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitch at www.shatontv.com/Twitch, on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcast. The website is shatontv.com. You can email us at host@shatontv.com or call us at 914-719-SHAT. Again, if you want to get in for the Telegraph, which comes out on Friday, please get us your email and voicemail by Wednesday afternoon so we have time to read it and process it. Also, if you haven't checked out our sister podcast, we will continue doing that even after Shat on TV Westworld is over for the season. That's at shatthemovies.com, where we do 80s and 90s movies. Ash is on there. I'm on there. The King Bee, Roger, and Big D, who we miss sorely.
Mm-hmm.
So be sure to check that out. Also, if you haven't checked out any of the other TV shows we do, I know a lot of people are going back and watching shows during the coronavirus pandemic, being safe at home. You can go ahead and check those out. We do American Gods, Taboo, True Detective, Watchmen, and Game of Thrones. That's all there at shatontv.com. Wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please leave a review. That helps the podcast grow. Other ways you can support the podcast is please go to shatontv.com/support, where you can find ways to make financial contributions, and go to shatontv.com/shop, where you can buy some sweet, sweet merch like Catherine and Jacob did. On behalf of my co-hosts, Big D, Dick Ebert, Ashley Schlafly, Roger Roper, and the King Bee, I'm Gene Lyons. Thanks so much for listening to this deep dive, and be sure to join us on Friday for the Westworld Telegraph covering Season 3, Episode 7, Passed Upon. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay the fuck at home.